She's completely useless, Patricia. I don't know what my son was thinking. Harper froze at the end of the hallway, her hand still on the wall for balance, her grocery bags cutting into her fingers. She recognized that voice immediately. Her mother-in-law, Judith, the same woman who had smiled at her over the breakfast table less than 2 hours ago and said, "Have a safe trip to the market, sweetheart." Judith was standing near the back fence with their neighbor Patricia, speaking in that low, confiding tone that women use when they believe no one important is listening. She doesn't cook properly. She barely lifts a finger around the house, and Callum works himself half to death while she does what, exactly? Go shopping? Judith let out a short, bitter laugh. I raised my son better than this. I don't know what she did to convince him she was worth marrying. Harper stood still. She didn't move. She didn't breathe loudly. She just listened, the cold autumn air coming in through the side gate she'd left open, the plastic bags turning her knuckles white. Patricia made a soft sound of sympathy. That must be so hard on you. It is, Judith said. And she acts like everything is fine. Very charming on the surface. But behind closed doors? She contributes nothing. She has no ambition, no direction. I honestly think she trapped him. Trapped him. Harper set the bags down quietly on the concrete beside the gate and pressed her back against the fence. She looked up at the gray October sky, that specific flat gray that settles over southern Ontario like a lid coming down, and she made herself breathe slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her doctor had taught her when her anxiety got bad. She didn't go inside through the back. She walked around to the front door, picked up her bags, and went in like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just heard the woman she had tried, genuinely tried, to love for 3 years, tell their neighbor that she was a trap. Callum had met Judith's expectations exactly once in his adult life, and that was the day he'd gotten a job in finance. Everything after that, the apartment in Hamilton he'd rented before they moved in with Judith temporarily, the friends his mother didn't like, and eventually Callum himself, had gradually shifted into the category of things Judith tolerated rather than celebrated. Harper had known this going in. Callum had warned her. He'd said, "She's not easy. She has strong opinions. She'll come around." He'd said it the way people say things they want to be true. They'd moved into Judith's house in Ancaster 8 months ago. Callum had been laid off in February, right after they'd signed the lease on a place in Dundas, and Judith had offered the solution before the ink was dry on their lease termination notice. "Just until you're back on your feet," she'd said. "I have the spaces." It makes no sense to throw money away on rent. It had made sense at the time. Judith had a 4-bedroom house, only herself and her youngest, Mitchell, rattling around in it. Mitchell was 22, worked at a dealership in Stony Creek, and mostly kept to himself. The plan was 6 months, maybe 8. Enough time for Callum to find a new position, save aggressively, and get them into a place of their own. The plan had not accounted for Judith. Judith, who rearranged Harper's groceries without asking, who suggested, gently but persistently, that Callum should be applying to companies Judith had selected, in roles Judith had decided were appropriate, at salary ranges that Judith had researched, who referred to the main bedroom as Callum's room when speaking to friends as if Harper were a temporary guest who'd overstayed. Judith, who apparently told the neighbors that her son had been trapped. Harper was a project coordinator at a mid-sized construction firm in Burlington. She'd been there for 4 years, worked her way up from admin, and currently managed 3 residential development files simultaneously. She was not, by any measurable standard, a woman without direction. She made a reasonable salary, kept meticulous records of her shared household expenses in a spreadsheet she updated every 2 weeks, and on the months Callum had been between jobs, she had quietly absorbed the difference without complaint. None of this, apparently, had made its way into Judith's conversations with Patricia. She sat in the kitchen that evening, while Callum talked about a promising interview he'd had that afternoon, and Mitchell ate cereal directly from the box, and Judith moved around them all, refilling glasses, adjusting things on the counter. Watching her move, Harper tried to find the architecture of the lie. Where had it come from? Was it deliberate? Was Judith so convinced of the story she'd told herself that she no longer noticed the distance between it and reality? She helped clean up after dinner. She washed the roasting pan without being asked. She said goodnight to Mitchell and thanked Judith for the meal, even though Judith had made the roast, and Harper had made the salad, the garlic bread, and the dessert. She didn't say that part. Upstairs, she sat on the edge of the bed while Callum changed out of his interview clothes, and she almost told him. She got as far as opening her mouth, but she looked at him, tired and hopeful and already carrying the weight of 8 months of job searching. And she closed it again. Not yet, she thought. Let me understand what I'm actually dealing with first. She started paying closer attention. It started small. She began noticing the way Judith spoke about her to Callum, and more specifically, what she left out. When Callum mentioned that Judith had praised the Thursday night stew, Judith didn't correct the record by noting that Callum had cooked it. When Harper finished painting the fence in the backyard, a project she'd taken on one long weekend in September, Judith mentioned it to her sister on the phone as though she'd done it herself. We finally got the fence sorted out. Not wrong, exactly. Just framed to disappear Harper from the story. She mentioned the fence to Callum, carefully, just as a passing observation. He laughed a little. That's just how she talks, he said. She says we for everything. It's a generational thing. Maybe. But it was also a pattern. 2 weeks after overhearing the conversation with Patricia, Judith had a few women from her book club over for tea. Harper came home from work to find them in the living room, and she smiled and introduced herself, and one of the women, a cheerful woman named Bev, who had silver hair and kind eyes, said, "Oh, so you're the daughter-in-law. Judy talks about you." Judith, across the room, adjusted a cushion. "All good things, I hope," Harper said lightly. Bev paused a half-second too long before saying, "Of course." And in that pause, Harper heard everything. She excused herself to change out of her work clothes. She sat upstairs for 10 minutes and thought carefully. She was not an impulsive person. She did not like drama. She especially did not like the idea of Callum being caught in the middle of something painful. But she was also 31 years old, and she had worked too hard for too long to sit quietly while someone dismantled her character in her own temporary home. She needed to know the full picture, and then she needed to decide what to do with it. The full picture arrived in pieces over the following month. Mitchell, who was generally indifferent to household politics, said something to her one morning over coffee that stuck. He'd been telling her about a girl he was seeing, and somehow the conversation had turned to Callum, and Mitchell had said, offhandedly, Mom thought he'd marry Steph. From high school. She was already kind of planning it. He broke up with Steph 10 years ago, Harper said. Mitchell shrugged. Yeah, but Mom. He said it the way you'd explain a weather system. Immovable and not particularly personal. Stephanie. Callum had mentioned her once, briefly, as a first love, someone he'd grown apart from at university. Judith apparently had never quite accepted the update. Knowing this didn't change what was happening, but it gave it a shape. Judith wasn't performing generalized disapproval. She had a specific story she'd wanted Callum's life to follow, and Harper arrived in that story as the wrong ending. The second piece came when Callum mentioned, casually, that his aunt, Judith's older sister Lorraine, who lived in Kitchener, had called to ask how he was doing. She said she'd heard things were tough, he said. I didn't even know Mom had talked to her. What kind of things? Harper asked. Just, the job stuff. He paused. And maybe some stuff about how the household is running. I don't know. Lorraine likes to get involved. Lorraine likes to get involved because Judith had called her. Judith, who told Patricia. Judith, who let Bev's book club absorb a version of Callum's life that quietly edited out the parts she didn't prefer. Judith building a case across multiple audiences, one conversation at a time. The third piece was the most specific. Harper had left her iPad on the kitchen counter one afternoon, and when she came back for it, the screen was still on. She'd been looking at their savings account before leaving for work, and hadn't locked it. She would never know if Judith had looked at it deliberately or accidentally, but that evening, Judith made a comment at dinner about it being smart not to live beyond your means, and she looked at Callum when she said it. Callum nodded. He didn't know what he was agreeing to. Judith knew how much they had saved. She knew exactly how far they were from being able to leave, and Harper understood, sitting there with her fork in her hand, that Judith was not simply difficult. Judith was, in her own organized way, managing the situation. She called her mother that week. Her mom, Sandra. No, wait, she thought of her mom, Louise, who still lived in the Waterloo region, in the house where Harper and her brother had grown up, who made tea in a ceramic pot, and never once in Harper's life had made her feel like a problem to be solved. I need to tell you something, Harper said. She told her. All of it. The fence, the book club pause. Mitchell and Steph, the savings account, the conversation by the back gate. Her mom listened without interrupting, which was a skill Harper valued deeply. What does Callum know? Her mom asked. Almost nothing. I've been protecting him, from his own mother, from having to choose. He's already stressed about the job. I didn't want to add this. There was a pause. Her mom said gently, Harper, that's not protecting him. That's making a decision for him. She sat with that for a long time after they hung up. She thought about Callum. Good. Decent, occasionally oblivious Callum, and about what it meant to love someone carefully versus loving them honestly. She had spent months absorbing something she should have brought to him. She had managed the situation alone, quietly, the way she always managed things, efficiently and without asking for help. That was its own kind of mistake. The conversation she'd been avoiding had a way of choosing its own moment. It happened on a Tuesday in late November. Callum had gotten a second interview with a company in Oakville, a real one, with good signs, and he came home looking lighter than he had in weeks. Mitchell was at his girlfriend's. Judith was at her book club. They sat in the kitchen after dinner, just the two of them with mugs of tea, and Callum said, "If this comes through, we'll start looking for a place right away. I promise. I know this has been longer than we planned." "It has been," Harper said. "And then, there's something I need to tell you," she told him. Not dramatically, not in accusations. She laid it out the way she would lay out a project file, clearly in order with specifics. The back gate, Patricia, what Judith had said word for word as best she could remember, the book club, Mitchell's comment about Steph, the savings account, the comment at dinner. Callum listened. She watched his face move through several things, confusion, then discomfort, then a slow, reluctant recognition. "She said things to you?" he asked. "No, never directly. That's part of what makes it hard to name." He was quiet for a long time. He put his mug down. "I've made excuses for her," he finally said, "for years. I kept thinking she'd come around. I know. She's been telling people, for a while, I think." He looked at her then with something complicated in his face. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" It was the right question, and she'd been sitting with the honest answer for 2 weeks. "Because I thought I was protecting you. But I think I was actually just managing it myself so it didn't become a real problem." She paused. "I should have told you sooner. That was my mistake." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. They stayed like that for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen while the furnace clicked on downstairs. "I need to talk to her," he said. "I know. Not tonight. But soon. I know that too." Judith came home at 9:30, unwrapping her scarf in the front hall. Callum had already decided to wait, to do this properly, not in the heat of the evening. But as Judith came into the kitchen for her glass of water before bed, she saw their faces and stopped. "What's wrong?" Callum looked at his mother. "We need to have a conversation. Not tonight. But this week, the three of us. There are things Harper's heard that you need to know she's heard." Judith went very still. It was the stillness of someone recalculating, and Harper recognized it. Because she'd seen it before in project meetings, when someone realized the numbers they'd submitted were wrong, and there was no longer a graceful way to exit. "I'm sure whatever you think you heard," Judith began. "We're not doing this tonight," Callum said quietly but completely. "I love you, Mom, and we're going to talk about this properly, but not at 10 o'clock at night." Judith looked at Harper. Harper held her gaze and said nothing. There was nothing she needed to say. Judith went to bed. The conversation happened on a Thursday evening. Callum was steady throughout it. Not cruel, not loud, but very clear. He said he had pieced things together himself over the years. Things he had explained away, and that hearing what Harper had experienced made him realize how much he'd let slide in the name of keeping the peace. Judith cried. She said she only wanted what was best for Callum. She said she was sorry if Harper had felt unwelcome. She said she hadn't realized. Harper didn't argue with the word if. She'd already decided what she needed from this conversation, and it wasn't an apology structured precisely to her satisfaction. What she needed was for Callum to understand what had been happening, and he did. What she didn't expect was what Judith said near the end, when the worst of the crying was over, and she was sitting at her own kitchen table looking smaller than usual. "I miss being needed," Judith said, not to either of them in particular. "When Callum was young, I knew exactly what I was supposed to do. And now," she stopped. She looked at her hands. It wasn't an excuse. Harper knew that. But it was, at least, something real. Something that didn't have a script around it. She didn't forgive Judith that evening. Forgiveness isn't something that happens in one Thursday night kitchen conversation. But she understood, more than she had before, that the story Judith had been telling the neighbors was not really about Harper at all. It was about a woman who had organized her entire sense of purpose around a son who no longer needed to be organized, and who had responded to that loss by filling in the gap with a villain. Harper hadn't asked to play that role, but she understood, now, how it had been cast. Callum's Oakville job came through in December. They signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in Waterdown 3 weeks later, close enough to visit, far enough to breathe. Moving day was a Saturday in January. Judith stood on the front steps while they loaded the truck, and she handed Callum a bag of things she'd put together, some kitchen items, a throw blanket she knew he liked, a card she'd written. She hugged him for a long time. Then she looked at Harper. I hope you'll both come for Sunday dinners sometimes, she said. When you feel like it, we will, Harper said. And she meant it. Not every week, not without conditions, but she meant it. In the truck, Callum reached over and squeezed her hand. The January light was doing what it does in Ontario in January. Thin and very clear, the kind that makes everything look precise and a little fragile. The kind that shows you exactly what's there. How are you feeling, he asked. Harper thought about the back gate and the bags cutting her fingers in the flat gray October sky. About all the Thursday night dinners and the 2-week spreadsheets and the months she'd spent quietly making herself useful in a house where the story being told about her had nothing to do with who she was. Honest answer? She said. He nodded. Like myself again. He pulled out of the driveway, and they drove toward Waterdown in the clear winter light, and Harper watched the street in the passenger window until Judith's house was gone from view, and felt, for the first time in 8 months, that the space around her was entirely her own.